The following morning, sunlight poured over New Orleans in slanted, golden sheets, but Maya barely noticed. She had not slept. The image of that pale crescent mark looped endlessly in her mind, colliding with the bedtime fragments of her mother's words. She walked across the campus of Delgado Community College with her notebook tucked under her arm, but lectures were only background noise. Her professors might as well have been speaking through water. All she heard was her mother's whisper, "He carried it here, same as you." By afternoon, her distraction drove her somewhere she had not visited in months, the city archives, tucked away in a quiet district near Jackson Square. It was not the kind of place most students wandered, but to Maya it felt like a doorway into hidden truths. She had grown up hearing half-stories. Her mother, Lena, spoke of laughter and summers by the river but always fell silent when Maya asked about her father. Instead of names, she gave metaphors. Instead of dates, she offered sighs. And always, the trace of that birthmark. Inside the archives, dust hovered in beams of light, settling over the shoulders of researchers bent across long oak tables. Maya signed her name on the visitor ledger and headed toward the bound newspaper reels, hands trembling as she fed microfilm into the reader. She searched the years when her mother would have been young, focusing on the business section, charity pages, anything that might bear Edward Sterling's name. It didn't take long. His face stared back at her from headlines, smiling beside politicians, standing at podiums, breaking ground with ceremonial shovels. Yet what arrested her was not the grandeur of his presence but the ghostly shadow of her mother. There, in a photograph announcing a scholarship program Sterling had funded 2 decades ago, Lena stood among a crowd of nursing students, almost hidden in the background. She was not mentioned in the article, not named, not quoted. Just a blurred face behind a man claiming to give opportunity. Maya leaned closer, tracing the image with her finger. Her stomach tightened. It was not proof, not yet, but it was a thread. It told her that their lives had crossed paths, even if the world never cared to record it. That night, unable to contain herself, Maya drafted a blog post. Her words bled from the keyboard. Some stories are never written down. Some names are erased before they are spoken. My mother lived in the shadow of someone celebrated for his influence, but her voice was never carried into those rooms. I am not searching for wealth, nor for a surname to wear like an ornament. I am searching for recognition. That silence stole something from us, and silence should not be our inheritance. She clicked publish before she could hesitate. Within hours, the post spread across social networks, gathering comments, shares, messages from strangers who whispered their own invisible stories. Some offered sympathy, others sent skepticism. But the tide was undeniable. And in a quiet corner office overlooking Canal Street, Edward Sterling sat before his computer, staring at the screen where her words glowed. He had not heard the name Lena Ellis in years, yet the mention pierced through layers of denial. The blog did not accuse him directly, but the crescent-shaped scar on his wrist burned as if someone had carved the truth back into his flesh. For the first time in decades, Edward closed his laptop and turned off the lights. His empire felt fragile. His silence had finally found its echo. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers that looked like frozen waterfalls, each crystal shard refracting the amber glow of 100 candles. Music swelled from a corner stage where a jazz quartet played something smooth enough to blend into conversation but sharp enough to remind the guests that this was a night meant to be remembered. Beyond the tall windows, New Orleans' French Quarter hummed with its usual mix of laughter, carriages, and echoes of brass bands, but inside the Hotel Marigny's Grand Hall, silence could command more attention than the instruments. On the edge of the room, carrying a silver tray that wobbled only slightly in her grip, stood a young server named Maya Ellis. Her dark curls were tied back with a black ribbon, her uniform pressed to perfection, yet her hands carried the faint tremor of someone who was both exhausted and determined. She moved between silk dresses and tailored suits, offering champagne flutes to men whose cufflinks alone could pay her rent for 6 months. For them, the gala was another chance to flaunt fortune. For her, it was another shift that might cover groceries, textbooks, and a bus ticket home. At the center of the crowd, laughter rose around Edward Sterling, a name sewn into half the city's skyline. Hotels, bridges, charity plaques, all bore his family crest. He was tall, silver-haired, and effortlessly commanding, the kind of man who had spent a lifetime expecting the room to adjust around him. Tonight, he was the guest of honor, celebrating the groundbreaking of his newest development, a riverfront museum meant to immortalize culture. Cameras had already flashed in his direction. Speeches were scheduled. Sterling carried himself as though history itself had made a seat at the table for him. Maya had no intention of lingering near him. Yet fate has a way of collapsing distances. As she leaned forward to place another glass on a passing tray, her eyes caught something at the edge of his cuff, a pale crescent-shaped mark carved naturally into his skin, glowing faintly beneath the chandeliers. Her breath stalled. She nearly dropped the glass. That shape was too familiar. It was not just any mark, it was the same one her mother, Lena, used to trace on her wrist when tucking her into bed. "Your father," her mother once whispered, a voice laced with a bittersweet tenderness Maya never understood, had the same sign. Same place. Like the moon was kissing us both. The memory struck her with the force of a bell. Her tray shook, a drop of champagne splashed onto her wrist, cold as lightning. Her gaze locked on the man whose empire gleamed around him, and for the first time she saw not power, not wealth, but a hidden familiarity etched in flesh. Sterling noticed the pause. His conversation faltered as his eyes followed her stare. Their gazes met, just for a second. Something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of recognition, though impossible, though absurd. He adjusted his cuff hastily, but the gesture only sharpened the suspicion clawing at Maya's chest. The rest of the night blurred. She moved like a ghost among the guests, replaying her mother's voice. Questions tangled with fear: could it be him? Could the man celebrated for monuments and fortune also be the ghostly absence that haunted her childhood? When the gala ended, she slipped outside into the humid night, heart racing as the city's music swallowed her. She didn't know yet that this single glimpse would unravel everything, her identity, his silence, and the buried history that connected them both. Edward Sterling had built his reputation on poise. Even in heated negotiations, he was the man who adjusted his tie instead of raising his voice, who waited a silence longer than others could bear and then spoke with finality. But that night, seated in the solitude of his penthouse overlooking the Mississippi, he felt like a man cornered by his own reflection. The skyline he had helped shape glittered below, yet the words from Maya's blog rang louder than any city light: silence should not be our inheritance. He poured himself a glass of scotch but let it sit untouched. On the desk before him lay a stack of letters he had never opened, envelopes yellowed with time, each bearing Lena's handwriting. For years, he had moved them from drawer to drawer, desk to safe, safe to box, never daring to slit the paper. Every unopened envelope had been a victory for cowardice, proof that denial could masquerade as strength. His father's voice returned, sharp as it had been in his youth: "A Sterling does not squander himself on sentiment. Marry well, keep your name clean, and the city will follow." Edward had obeyed. He had chosen prestige over passion, silence over confrontation. Lena had been the dream he exiled to memory, until now, when her daughter's voice dragged the past into daylight. Meanwhile, Maya's blog post swelled into something larger than she imagined. A local paper ran a short piece on it, framing it as a viral essay on heritage and invisibility. Her classmates whispered when she entered lectures, some with admiration, others with skepticism. She tried to stay grounded, reminding herself this was not about fame. It was about answers. Yet the more attention her words attracted, the more pressure she felt to stand firm, to not falter under eyes waiting to see if she would retreat. One evening, as she returned to her small apartment, she found an envelope slid beneath the door. Heavy paper, embossed with a crest she recognized instantly: Sterling's seal. Her pulse quickened as she opened it. Inside was a short note, written in Edward's steady hand. If what you seek is truth, I owe you at least one conversation. Tomorrow. The Crescent Café, South Market Street. Noon. She stared at the words until they blurred. Anger surged. How dare he summon her like an employee to a meeting? And yet beneath the anger lay an ache she could not deny. This was the man her mother had loved, the man who might hold the missing pieces of her identity. She folded the note carefully and placed it between the pages of her notebook. The next morning, Maya dressed plainly but with intention. She chose the blue scarf her mother once wore, the one faintly scented with lavender even after years. As she walked through the streets toward the café, the city bustled around her, unaware that in a few minutes, decades of silence would be tested. Inside the café, Edward sat already, his hands clasped around a coffee he had not sipped. When Maya stepped in, the bell above the door chimed softly. Their eyes met, and for the first time, the space between them was not a ballroom filled with strangers, but a narrow table where truth had no place left to hide. The Crescent Café was the sort of place where time seemed to soften. Its brick walls held photographs of jazz musicians long gone, its shelves stacked with well-worn books no one had touched in years. Outside, the street hummed with the usual midday rhythm, vendors calling, streetcars rattling, but within those walls, silence pressed like a tide. Edward Sterling rose slightly when Maya entered, an old habit of courtesy, though the motion looked awkward, as if politeness had grown rusty on him. Maya did not offer her hand. She slid into the chair across from him, folding her arms, her scarf a fragile barrier between them. "Thank you for coming," Edward began, his voice measured, deliberate. "I didn't come for thanks," Maya replied. Her words were not loud, but each carried the clarity of someone who had waited her whole life to speak. "I came for answers." He nodded, as though he expected nothing less. For a moment, neither moved. The waiter appeared, dropped off water glasses, and vanished with the intuition of someone who sensed the weight of unspoken history. Edward drew in a slow breath. "Your mother, Lena, she was remarkable. Smarter than I deserved, kinder than I understood. His voice cracked, just enough to betray the composure he tried to wear. "I loved her." Maya's jaw tightened. Hearing her mother's name in his voice felt like salt against an open wound. Then why wasn't she enough? Why wasn't I enough? The question cut deeper than any accusation. Edward leaned back, eyes clouding with years he had never confessed. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of losing the life my family demanded of me. Afraid of scandal, of whispers in country clubs, of the boardroom turning cold. My father raised me to believe silence was survival." Maya leaned forward. "Silence wasn't survival. It was theft. You stole her dignity, and you stole my right to know who I was." The words landed like stones. Edward lowered his gaze, his cuff slipping enough for the crescent birthmark to show. He didn't hide it this time. "You're right," he whispered. "And I can't undo what's been taken." From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a sealed envelope, its edges frayed, the handwriting unmistakable. "Your mother wrote this to me. I never opened it. I couldn't. But it belongs to you now." Maya stared at the letter as if it were burning. Her hand trembled when she took it, tucking it carefully into her bag without breaking the seal. She wasn't ready. Not yet. "This isn't about money," she said firmly. "I don't care about your name or your empire. I want acknowledgment. I want my mother to no longer be invisible." Edward's throat tightened. For the first time in decades, the skyscraper of his composure crumbled. "Then tell me how," he asked quietly. "Tell me where to begin." Maya studied him, not as a titan of wealth but as a man stripped of defenses. In his eyes she saw fear, regret, and something else, perhaps the smallest seed of courage. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. But it was the faintest outline of possibility. When she rose to leave, Edward did not stop her. He remained at the table, hands clasped, as though praying to a god he had abandoned long ago. Outside, the sun broke through clouds, spilling light across the street. Maya stepped into it, clutching the unopened letter, aware that the road ahead was still tangled, but at least it had finally begun. That night, Maya sat cross-legged on her narrow bed, the letter resting on her lap like an artifact from a world she had only glimpsed. The paper was aged, its edges curled slightly as though time itself had been gnawing at it. Her mother's handwriting curved across the envelope, a script Maya had memorized from grocery lists and school notes slipped into her lunchbox. Seeing it now, preserved and sealed, felt like staring at a door her mother had closed, leaving her to decide whether it should ever be opened. She reached for it 3 times, each attempt faltering. Some part of her feared that breaking the seal would collapse whatever image she still carried of her mother. What if the words revealed disappointment? Or worse, resignation? Eventually she placed the letter on her nightstand and turned off the lamp, convincing herself that delay was a kind of control. Across the city, Edward Sterling wandered the hallways of his penthouse like a man pacing his own guilt. He paused in front of a mahogany cabinet, its top drawer holding the rest of Lena's letters. Dozens. All unopened. He pulled one free, ran his thumb across the envelope, and for a moment almost tore it open. Instead, he returned it to its place and shut the drawer with a decisive thud. Cowardice had grown into muscle memory. Yet tonight, after years of denial, the habit felt heavier. Maya, meanwhile, found herself drawn back to the archives 2 days later. She wanted more than one photograph, more than one shadow. The librarians recognized her now and guided her toward stacks of community newsletters, small circulation papers that chronicled neighborhood events. There, buried in the fine print of a charity gala from 20 years earlier, she found her mother's name listed not as a guest of honor but as assistant volunteer. No title, no quote. Just 3 words, Lena Ellis, helper. The injustice stung sharper than she expected. Her mother had always laughed about blending into the background, claiming it freed her to observe life's colors. But Maya understood now, it wasn't choice. It was erasure. That evening, she returned to her blog, posting another entry. My mother wasn't invisible. She was erased. She worked, she gave, she loved, but when the lights turned on, her presence was dimmed to a shadow. I won't let her story be archived as a footnote. The post gained traction faster than the first. Journalists began sending emails. A professor invited her to speak at a campus forum about identity and heritage. For the first time, Maya felt her voice stretching beyond her own apartment walls. But the attention carried consequences. Sterling's board of directors noticed. They gathered in his office, men and women whose loyalty was bound not by affection but by investments. One of them laid the printed blog posts on his desk. This is becoming a problem, she said flatly. Rumors of illegitimate children will shake investor confidence. Handle it. Edward looked down at the pages, at Maya's words. Once, he would have obeyed the command. Once, he would have buried the story beneath money and silence. But now the weight of unopened letters pressed too heavily on his chest. For the first time in decades, he considered that perhaps silence was no longer protection, it was poison. As night fell, Maya finally picked up the envelope again. Her fingers hovered at the seal. She inhaled, exhaled. Slowly, she tore it open. The paper inside trembled in her hands as she unfolded it. Her mother's words, written long ago, spilled into the room. Edward, I do not ask for wealth. I ask for courage. If you cannot stand beside us, then at least do not pretend we never existed. Maya pressed the letter against her chest. Tears blurred the ink. Her mother's voice had crossed decades to meet her. The silence was broken. Maya carried the letter with her everywhere that week, folded neatly in her notebook like a heartbeat she could not ignore. At the library, on the bus, even while waiting tables, she found herself touching the paper through her bag as though the words might dissolve if left alone. Her mother's plea, "At least do not pretend we never existed," echoed louder than the clinking of dishes or the chatter of strangers. It was a demand for truth, and Maya had no intention of letting it die in silence. Her classmates noticed the change in her. She spoke less in lectures but wrote with a clarity that startled even her professors. One encouraged her to expand her blog into a public talk. "Your story is powerful," he said, "and power has a way of unsettling the right people." She smiled faintly, aware he meant it as praise, though the words carried an edge of warning. Meanwhile, Edward Sterling's world trembled in small but undeniable shifts. He attended meetings where younger executives whispered about public perception and controlling the narrative. For years he had controlled every headline with ease. Now, one 22-year-old student was challenging the fortress of his reputation. Yet what unsettled him most was not the threat of scandal but the familiar curve of Lena's handwriting burned into Maya's letter. Each time he pictured it, shame welled in his chest like smoke. One evening, Edward drove without direction and found himself outside a modest neighborhood in Gentilly, far from the gleaming towers of his empire. He parked near a mural painted on a cracked brick wall, magnolia blossoms blooming in impossible colors. Children's laughter drifted from a corner store. He realized this was Lena's world, the world he had abandoned. For a long moment, he sat gripping the wheel, torn between stepping out and driving away. In the end, he stayed in the car, paralyzed, until night deepened and he turned back toward the riverfront towers. Maya, unaware of his silent pilgrimage, was forging her own path. She accepted the invitation to speak at a campus forum titled, "Stories Unwritten." On stage, beneath dim lights and a modest crowd, she read from her mother's letter. Her voice did not waver. "My mother asked for courage," she said. "She didn't receive it from the man she loved. But her words traveled through time to me, and I will not waste them. Silence is not neutrality, it's surrender. And surrender steals futures." The room fell silent before applause spread, hesitant at first, then swelling until it filled the hall. Reporters in the audience scribbled furiously. By the next morning, her words appeared in headlines, snippets carried across social feeds. Silence is not neutrality, it's surrender. In his penthouse, Edward read those words in the paper. He set it down, staring at the skyline. The city that once praised him now looked at him with suspicion. And yet, for the first time, he felt a strange flicker of relief. Someone was finally saying the truth he had buried. Someone braver than he had ever been. Still, courage was not yet his. He rehearsed speeches in front of the mirror, only to fall silent halfway through. He drafted statements to his board, deleting them before anyone could see. Every attempt ended in hesitation, the same paralysis that had defined his youth. But when he looked at his wrist, at the crescent scar, it no longer resembled inheritance. It resembled indictment. The pattern of silence was breaking. The boardroom on the top floor of Sterling Enterprises had always been Edward's sanctuary. Long mahogany tables, glass walls with sweeping views of the river, a place where decisions about millions were made with the flick of a pen. He had walked into that room for 30 years with his shoulders squared, his voice steady, his reputation unshakable. But that morning, as the directors gathered, Edward felt like a man stepping onto thin ice. The meeting began with financial reports, charts projected on the wall, numbers that once would have anchored his confidence. But soon the conversation turned, as he knew it would. A director named Marjorie, sharp-eyed, with decades of loyalty not to him but to the Sterling fortune, laid a folded newspaper on the table. Across the front page was a photograph of Maya at the campus forum, her voice caught mid-sentence, the caption beneath quoting her, "Silence is not neutrality, it's surrender." "This is spiraling," Marjorie said flatly. "Investors are calling. Rumors are already denting confidence. We cannot afford scandal, Edward. You must issue a denial. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Words like paternity, inheritance, credibility circled like vultures. Edward remained still, his hands pressed together, the crescent birthmark hidden beneath his sleeve. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower than usual but sharper. And if it's not a rumor? The room froze. Silence stretched, heavy and electric. A younger executive coughed nervously. Marjorie's expression hardened. Then we bury it, she said. The city loves your name. It will choose you over some girl with a blog. Don't complicate this. Edward's jaw tightened. He remembered Lena's laugh, soft as summer rain, and the unopened letters he had carried like shackles. He remembered Maya's eyes across the cafe table, demanding acknowledgment, not wealth. For the first time, he realized that burying the truth had not preserved him, it had corroded him. He leaned forward. I will not deny her, he said. Shock rippled around the table. One man shifted uncomfortably, another whispered under his breath. Marjorie's voice rose, incredulous. Edward, do you understand what you're saying? You will destroy everything you've built. No, Edward replied, steady now. Everything I built was already flawed. I chose silence when I should have chosen courage. That's the foundation. And it's cracking. The room erupted. Voices overlapping, warnings shouted, threats disguised as advice. Edward sat in the middle of the storm, strangely calm. For decades he had feared this moment, convinced it would end him. Instead, it felt like the first honest breath he had taken since he was 21. When the meeting adjourned in chaos, Edward did not wait for the elevator. He took the stairs, descending floor by floor, his footsteps echoing against the steel. With each step, the weight of silence lightened, though the consequences loomed. Meanwhile, Maya walked through the French market with her notebook pressed against her side. Street musicians played near the stalls, and the air smelled of roasted coffee and fried dough. She paused by a vendor selling hand-carved masks, her reflection fractured in painted wood. For a moment, she thought of Sterling's empire, the mask he had worn, the mask her mother had been forced to endure. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unfamiliar number. I will not hide this anymore. Meet me tomorrow. Publicly, if you choose. E. Maya's breath caught. She tucked the phone away, staring at the river beyond the stalls. The waters moved slow and deep, carrying secrets toward the gulf. Tomorrow, one of them would surface. The news spread quickly. Edward Sterling would be speaking at the Civic Center, originally to unveil a new development plan. The announcement had been scheduled for months, but the timing now carried an electricity no one could ignore. Whispers threaded through the city. Would he address the rumors? Would he deny them? Or would he, for the first time, step into the light he had always controlled but never fully inhabited? Maya heard the news that morning as she sipped coffee in her apartment, the radio crackling with speculation. Her phone lit with messages from classmates, journalists, even strangers who had read her blog. Are you going? One asked. Another, this is your moment. She didn't answer. She stared at her mother's letter, still folded neatly, the ink slightly smudged where her tears had once touched it. Courage was Lena's final request. Courage was what Maya owed her. By noon, the Civic Center buzzed with reporters, cameras, and a restless audience of investors, city officials, and curious citizens. Maya slipped into the crowd quietly, her scarf pulled close around her neck. She found a seat near the back, heart hammering. The stage was set with banners displaying Sterling Enterprises' emblem, a gleaming silver crest. At the podium, microphones bristled like hungry mouths. Edward Sterling appeared at last, his tailored suit immaculate, his shoulders broad beneath the weight of decades. Applause greeted him, though softer than usual, tinged with curiosity. He scanned the crowd, and though Maya doubted he could see her in the sea of faces, she felt his gaze settle. He began with the expected gestures, thanks to the city, acknowledgment of partners, a nod to progress. But as he spoke, his voice wavered, just slightly, when he reached for the next line of his prepared notes. He looked down at the papers, then back up, and in that moment something shifted. He set the notes aside. "I came here today to speak about buildings," Edward said, his voice steady now, "but there are foundations more fragile than steel and stone. Some are built on silence. And silence, I've learned, has a cost." A murmur ran through the audience. Cameras clicked rapidly. 20 years ago, he continued, I loved a woman named Lena Ellis. I failed her. I failed her because I let fear speak louder than truth. I let family pressure, reputation, and cowardice dictate my choices. And in that silence, I abandoned not just her, but her daughter, Maya. Gasps erupted. Reporters leaned forward like wolves catching scent. Investors exchanged frantic whispers. Edward's eyes lifted, and for the first time in public, the crescent-shaped mark on his wrist was visible, his cuff deliberately rolled back. "This is not a press strategy," he said. "It is an admission. I chose silence once. I will not choose it again." Maya's throat tightened. Around her, people craned their necks, searching the crowd for her. She remained seated, still, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. Edward ended with words that would echo beyond the hall. Family is not secured by contracts or by inheritance. It is secured by courage, by acknowledgment, by responsibility. I failed to show it then. I can only begin, belatedly, to show it now. The hall erupted, some in applause, others in outrage. Cameras flashed like lightning. Edward stepped back from the podium, not triumphant, not broken, but human at last. And in the back row, Maya rose quietly and walked out, the sound of his confession trailing after her like a long-delayed answer. The Civic Center emptied in waves, reporters chasing quotes, investors whispering damage assessments, ordinary citizens buzzing with disbelief. Outside, the humid afternoon pulsed with sirens and chatter. Headlines were already forming. Sterling admits secret daughter, legacy shaken by long-held secret. Maya walked quickly down the steps, blending into the dispersing crowd. Her chest was tight, not from shame, but from the weight of hearing aloud what she had always known in fragments. Strangers passed, debating loudly. He admitted it. "Do you think she'll come forward? This'll ruin him." Maya pulled her scarf higher, unwilling to let their voices decide her story. She didn't go home. Instead, her steps carried her to Bayou Books, a small independent bookstore where she sometimes volunteered. The owner, a gray-haired woman named Denise, looked up as Maya entered. "You've been on the radio," Denise said softly, not unkindly. "Your words. People are listening." Maya managed a thin smile, then sank into a chair at the back, the smell of old paper wrapping around her. She needed space to breathe, to process what had just unraveled on a stage larger than anything she had imagined. Meanwhile, Edward faced his own storm. Outside the Civic Center, microphones thrust toward him like spears. "Mr. Sterling, do you intend to provide financial restitution? Will Maya be recognized legally? Do you regret the timing of your confession?" Edward answered none of it. He raised a hand politely, eyes shadowed, and slipped into his car. His driver waited for direction, but Edward sat silently, gazing at the crowds dispersing. For decades, he had mastered the art of controlling the story. Today, he had surrendered it. For once, the truth was loose in the world, and it was no longer his to edit. Back at her apartment that evening, Maya opened her laptop. Messages flooded her inbox, support from strangers, interview requests from national outlets, even cruel comments questioning her motives. She scrolled through them all, her pulse steady, until one message stopped her. It was from Edward. A single line. "If you will allow me, I would like to meet not in boardrooms or cafes, but in places that belong to your mother." Maya stared at the screen, conflicted. Part of her wanted to delete it, to leave him to his empire of regret. But another part, the part that carried Lena's laughter and Lena's silences, wondered if facing him again was necessary, not for him, but for herself. That night, she dreamt of her mother. Lena stood in a field of magnolias, her hands streaked with paint, smiling faintly. She did not speak. She only looked toward a path where moonlight spilled, and beside her appeared Edward, younger, uncertain, reaching but not quite touching. Maya woke with tears wetting her pillow, the echo of her mother's presence pressing her toward a decision. The following morning, she typed a reply. There is a cafe in Treme. My mother painted murals nearby. Meet me there. No press, no investors. Just answers. She hit send, closed the laptop, and exhaled. Across the city, Edward read the message. Relief and dread collided in his chest. This was no stage, no speech. This was where silence could not be rehearsed. The Treme Café was small, tucked between two brightly painted buildings that bore the scars of both time and resilience. Its windows framed the street outside, where murals splashed across cracked brick walls, faces of jazz legends, community activists, and anonymous figures given new life through color. One mural, Maya knew, had been touched by her mother's hand years ago. Lena had spent hours here, brush in hand, filling walls with blossoms and stars while Maya played nearby, not realizing those afternoons were her mother's attempts at leaving behind a visible mark. Maya arrived first, choosing a corner table with a view of the mural. She ordered nothing, only wrapped her fingers around the chipped ceramic mug the server offered as water. Her mother's presence felt near, as if the colors on the wall hummed with memory. Edward entered 15 minutes later. He looked older than he had on the Civic Center stage, the weight of confession etched deeper into his face. His suit was immaculate as always, but his tie was slightly loosened, an uncharacteristic detail that Maya did not miss. He paused at the door, scanning the cafe until he saw her. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither moved. When he finally approached, she did not rise. He sat across from her, folding his hands, leaving his wrist bare where the crescent mark curved like a quiet witness. You chose this place, he said softly. My mother painted that wall, Maya replied, tilting her head toward the mural of magnolia blossoms that bloomed impossibly large across the bricks. She told me once that if no one ever remembered her name, maybe they would still remember the colors. Edward swallowed hard. I should have remembered her name. I should have said it aloud when it mattered. Maya studied him carefully. Why didn't you? Tell me the truth. Not rehearsed, not for the cameras. Just the truth. He leaned back, eyes clouding. Because I was raised to believe love was weakness. My father drilled it into me, sterlings do not bend for sentiment. We build, we expand, we dominate. When I loved your mother, I felt like I was betraying that inheritance. I convinced myself that silence was strength. But it wasn't strength, it was cowardice. Maya's hands clenched around her mug. She died thinking she wasn't enough for you. Do you understand that? Edward's eyes flickered with pain. I understand. And I will carry it until I'm gone. He hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket. From it, he pulled a small silver locket, its chain delicate, tarnished with time. This was hers. She gave it to me the last time we spoke. I couldn't open it then. I didn't deserve to. But I believe it belongs to you now. Maya stared at the locket, her breath shallow. Slowly, she took it, her fingers brushing the cool metal. With a click, it opened to reveal a tiny photograph, her mother, younger, paint smudges on her cheek, smiling with a joy that broke Maya's heart. On the opposite side, folded small, was a piece of paper, a sketch of a crescent moon, drawn by hand. Tears blurred Maya's vision. She closed the locket and held it against her chest. You think giving me this fixes something? She whispered. No, Edward said, his voice breaking. It fixes nothing. But it acknowledges what I destroyed. And maybe, if you'll let me, it begins something new. Not as redemption, but as respect. For a long time, silence hung between them. Outside, children played along the mural, their laughter carrying through the open window. Maya finally spoke, her voice steady. Respect doesn't come from words or gifts. It comes from action. If you want me to believe you, then show me. Not with money, not with your name. With change. Edward nodded slowly. Then that is what I will try to do. Neither reached for a handshake. Neither offered closure. Instead, they sat in the quiet cafe, two lives stitched loosely together by a scar in the shape of a crescent moon. The notebook lay open on Maya's desk, its pages breathing color into her apartment. Each drawing revealed another piece of Lena, a magnolia half-finished, a child's smile caught in a few gentle lines, stars scattered across a darkened page as though even paper could hold night. Maya turned each page slowly, careful not to smudge the fading pencil strokes. It felt less like flipping through a sketchbook and more like holding conversation with her mother, one wordless exchange at a time. She carried the notebook with her to the community studio where she taught art to children on weekends. The kids crowded around, marveling at the sketches. Maya pointed to a drawing of a hand shaped like a crescent. This, she told them, was drawn when I was about your age. My mother said hands tell stories. The children traced the lines with their eyes, their small fingers hovering above the page as though they might feel its history. One boy asked, "Did she draw you too?" Maya hesitated, then nodded. "In every line," she said softly. Meanwhile, Edward was facing the slow unraveling of his empire. Investors pulled out of projects. Articles dissected his confession, some praising courage, others condemning weakness. The once unquestioned name of Sterling became the subject of debate in boardrooms and living rooms alike. Yet Edward, strangely, felt lighter. For the first time, he stopped rehearsing denials. For the first time, he chose honesty over control. He began visiting the Treme neighborhood quietly, sometimes alone, sometimes with staff. He funded the restoration of a mural that Lena had once painted, insisting her name be included on the plaque. Residents eyed him with suspicion at first, but as the weeks passed, they saw the sincerity in his persistence. He spoke little, listened much, and for once, his wealth served something beyond his image. Maya noticed. She didn't forgive, at least not yet, but she noticed. Respect, she had told him, was action. And here was action, imperfect but real. One evening, Edward asked if he might join her at the studio. She agreed reluctantly. When he arrived, the children stared wide-eyed at the tall, silver-haired man. Maya introduced him simply, "This is Edward. He's here to learn." Edward sat on the floor beside the children, awkward in his expensive suit, holding a stub of charcoal. The kids giggled at his stiff attempts to sketch a flower. Maya watched, arms folded, a flicker of irony warming her chest. The man who had once built towers now struggled to draw petals. But for the first time, he looked small in a way that wasn't weakness, it was humility. After class, Maya handed him a sheet of paper. "Draw your hand," she said. He hesitated, then pressed his palm against the page, tracing the outline. When he finished, the crescent birthmark curved at the base of the drawing. He stared at it, silent. "Hands tell stories," Maya reminded him. He nodded slowly. "Then it's time I stopped hiding mine." Later that night, he wrote his first letter in decades, not a press release, not a legal document, but a letter in his own hand. Addressed to Maya, it listed every moment he regretted, the unopened letters, the silences, the times he chose reputation over love. At the end, he wrote, "I cannot give you a childhood with a father. I can only ask for a future where my presence does not wound but supports. Not forgiveness, only permission to stand, quietly, if you will let me. He left the letter at her door, unsigned except for a simple E. Maya found it the next morning. She read it once, then twice, her chest tight. She didn't know yet what to do with it. But she kept it, slipping it between the pages of her mother's sketchbook, where stories too fragile for speech were safe. Spring arrived with the weight of renewal. Dogwoods bloomed along New Orleans streets, their pale blossoms shaking in the breeze, and the city seemed briefly softened by color. Maya, notebook under her arm, walked through the French Quarter one morning and felt something she had not in years, curiosity about tomorrow. Yet even as she breathed it in, the letter from Edward lingered in her mind. She had not answered. She wasn't ready. Edward, however, had decided on his own next step. He sent her a message with no preamble, no persuasion, only a request. There is one place left where silence has ruled too long. I ask you to come with me to Savannah. To Lena. Maya read it again and again. Her first instinct was to refuse. Why should she walk beside the man who had abandoned them? But then she thought of her mother's grave, visited only once years ago with Denise. She thought of the unanswered questions that still gnawed at her ribs. And she thought of the possibility that courage was not only speaking truth, but standing in its shadow without fleeing. 3 days later, they drove east in Edward's car, the road stretching endlessly through pine forests and flat plains. Conversation was scarce. The hum of tires filled the silence, broken only by the occasional map direction or request for gas. Yet beneath that quiet, Maya felt the hum of something deeper, two lives circling the same wound, unsure how to touch it without reopening everything. When they arrived in Savannah, the sky had turned a dusky gold. The cemetery lay beneath arching oaks, their branches draped in Spanish moss that swayed like veils. Edward parked at the edge, his hands gripping the wheel long after the engine stopped. Finally, he whispered, I haven't been here since the funeral. Maya stepped out first, the gravel crunching beneath her shoes. The air smelled of earth and salt, the river not far beyond. She led the way down narrow paths until they reached Lena's grave, a modest stone, half-shadowed by magnolia branches. Fresh blossoms had been left by someone anonymous, their petals still damp with morning dew. Maya knelt, fingertips brushing her mother's name carved into the stone. Emotion tightened her chest, words catching in her throat. She whispered, Mama, I'm here. Edward stood back, uncertain, his tall frame suddenly small against the weight of moss-draped trees. After a long pause, he stepped forward, removing his cufflink and rolling back his sleeve until the crescent mark showed. He placed his hand flat on the stone. Lena, he said quietly, voice shaking, I was a coward. I thought silence was strength. I was wrong. I can't ask you to forgive me. I only ask that Maya knows I loved you, even if I lacked the courage to show it. Maya turned toward him, tears blurring her vision. For the first time, she saw him stripped of empire and wealth, only a man kneeling in the shadow of his own failure. She didn't reach for him. But she didn't walk away either. From his pocket, Edward pulled a small, tarnished medallion. She gave me this once. I never opened it. I couldn't. But it belongs with you now. He handed it to Maya. Inside was a pressed magnolia petal, fragile yet intact. Maya held it tightly, her heart aching. She carried so much beauty. And you let it fade. Edward nodded, shame written in every line of his face. Yes. And that will follow me until I'm gone. But I don't want silence to follow you. The moss swayed overhead, a soft chorus to the confession. For a moment, the three of them, Lena in memory, Maya in grief, Edward in regret, were bound together in quiet communion. It was not forgiveness. It was not resolution. But it was presence. As they left the cemetery, Maya carried the medallion against her chest. She thought of her mother's words in the letter, I ask for courage. And she wondered if maybe courage meant continuing, not because wounds were healed, but because they were no longer hidden. The drive back from Savannah was quieter than the journey there. Edward kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, while Maya leaned against the window, watching the blur of trees and sky pass in silence. The medallion rested in her palm, its fragile petal preserved against time, a reminder of both her mother's beauty and her father's absence. She traced the edges of the silver casing, thinking of how something so delicate had survived when so much else had not. When they reached New Orleans, Maya didn't invite Edward in. Instead, she stepped out at her apartment, pausing long enough to say, "Thank you for taking me." He nodded once, his face unreadable, and drove away. That evening, she returned to the community studio, her sanctuary. The children greeted her with laughter, tugging at her sleeves, eager to show the drawings they had made in her absence. One girl, no older than 10, presented a picture of 3 hands overlapping, one small, one larger, one old. At the base of each wrist, she had drawn a crescent moon. Maya's breath caught. "Why did you draw this?" she asked gently. The girl shrugged, smiling shyly. "Because families can look like anything." Maya pressed the picture to her chest, fighting back tears. Children saw truth with a clarity adults often buried. Meanwhile, Edward sat at his desk in the penthouse, his empire in disarray. Contracts cancelled, partnerships wavering. For once, he didn't feel the urge to strategize his way back. Instead, he pulled out the old stack of unopened letters. He slit one open with careful hands. Lena's words spilled into the room, "Do not let fear make you smaller than you are. Life is wide, Edward. Step into it." He read until his eyes blurred, letter after letter, until dawn broke over the river. For decades, he had avoided her voice. Now it filled the silence he had once mistaken for survival. Days later, Maya received another envelope at her door. This time, it wasn't a plea or confession. Inside was a legal document. Edward had amended his will. Not to leave her money, she barely glanced at the financial clauses, but to establish a foundation in Lena's name, dedicated to supporting artists whose voices had been silenced or overlooked. The final line read, "Not inheritance, but acknowledgment." Maya closed the folder slowly. It was a gesture, not everything, not absolution, but a step. Respect shown not in promises but in permanence. Weeks passed. Their relationship did not transform overnight into closeness. They didn't share dinners or call each other daily. But Edward began appearing quietly at her public talks, always in the back row, listening. And Maya, though she never introduced him, no longer turned away when she caught his gaze. One afternoon, she invited him to the studio. This time, she didn't hand him a pencil or ask him to sketch. Instead, she showed him the children's drawings, their bright colors filling the walls. "This," she said, "is where my family is." Edward studied the artwork, his eyes softening. "Then let me stand at the edges," he replied. It wasn't a reconciliation sealed with hugs or tears. It was something smaller, quieter, and perhaps stronger, the willingness to remain present. As Maya walked home that evening, the city lights flickered against the river. She opened her notebook and wrote a single line beneath her mother's sketch of the crescent hand, "Family is not only blood, but responsibility chosen, again and again." She closed the book, feeling the weight of absence and presence woven together. For the first time, it felt like a beginning, not an echo. Autumn crept into New Orleans with cooler air and earlier dusks. Leaves skittered across sidewalks, the scent of wood smoke drifting faintly through the streets. At the community studio, Maya gathered her students for the final session before the holidays. The walls glowed with their art, rivers painted in impossible blues, faces half-formed but radiant, stars scattered across black paper like constellations waiting to be named. That day, Edward arrived quietly, as he had promised. He did not step into the spotlight, nor did he draw attention. He stood near the back, hands folded, his gaze resting not on Maya but on the children. He watched them laugh, argue over colors, spill water, and begin again. For him, it was a world he had never entered when he was young, a world he now observed with both envy and gratitude. Maya led the class through its closing exercise, tracing their hands on paper, then decorating them with colors and shapes that told their stories. One child drew flowers across her palm, another filled his fingers with music notes. When Maya traced her own hand, she hesitated. Then, carefully, she drew a crescent moon at the base of the wrist. The children noticed. "Why a moon?" one asked. "Because it's a reminder," Maya said softly. "That even in the dark, light can mark us. And sometimes it connects us, even when we don't want it to." The children nodded, satisfied. They taped their drawings on the wall, a mosaic of hands stretching toward one another. Maya looked at them and felt her mother's presence again, not as absence, but as continuity. After class, Edward lingered. Maya approached him, holding the silver medallion between her fingers. "This will never fix what's broken," she said quietly. He nodded. "I know. But," she continued, her voice steadier now, "it doesn't have to stay broken forever. Presence is different than forgiveness. And you've been present." Edward's eyes glistened, though he blinked quickly. "Then I'll remain here, at the edges, if you'll let me." She didn't embrace him. She didn't call him father. But she handed him a sheet of paper from the class exercise. On it, 3 hands overlapped, hers, a child's, and an older one she had drawn carefully. At the base of each, a crescent moon curved like a small, stubborn light. "Keep this," she said. "Not as proof. As reminder." Edward held the drawing delicately, as though it might crumble. For the first time in years, he felt something other than regret, the fragile beginning of belonging. Weeks later, Maya traveled again to Savannah. She brought fresh magnolias to her mother's grave, laying the medallion gently on the stone. Edward stood beside her, silent, not reaching for her hand but not walking away. The wind stirred the moss overhead, carrying a hush that felt less like avoidance and more like communion. As they turned to leave, Maya opened her notebook and sketched 3 hands, one young, one old, one holding them both. Beneath she wrote, "We were never lost. We were only waiting to be found." It was not a story of perfect reconciliation. It was not a fairy tale of erased pain. It was something smaller, harder, and perhaps more enduring, the rewriting of a legacy through presence, responsibility, and the courage to finally speak. And as the sun lowered over the magnolia trees, the silence they once feared became, at last, a language they could share.